for this meeting goes back exactly a year, actually. So it goes back to a session that was held at last year's Museums Association conference up in Edinburgh, when Graham Oliver from National Museum of Wales, who many of you will know, and Darren Mann, Head of Life Collections here in Oxford, organised a session on the fate of natural history collections in modern museums. The session was called The Elephant in the Room. And out of that quite interesting discussion, there were two almost diametrically opposed views that emerged. The one was that natural history collections are at risk. They're at risk for a variety of reasons. And the problem could be solved nationally for a relatively small amount of money in the overall scheme of things. And the Twitter sphere went absolutely bonkers when Darren provided the analogue that the Ashmolean had just that week purchased a Manet painting for £7.5 million. It wasn't even finished, actually, it was a sketch, but that's another matter. And Darren had calculated that every at-risk natural history collection in the UK, not just in England, could be saved comfortably within the purchase price of this one painting purchased by one institution. I'm not quite sure that it did as many favours within Oxford, but the tweeting went crazy and certainly brought the attention, brought the issue to the attention of a wider audience than was perhaps otherwise aware of it. So that was one of the conclusions. The opposite conclusion came up during discussion in that session, which is that natural history curators are no worse off than anybody else in the museum sector. It's just that they whinge more. And that developed some momentum during the discussion that really, you know, if we're so concerned, we should just do something about it. Don't just go to the Museums Association and whinge about it. And the truth is probably somewhere in between the two, or at least it combines the two, actually. It doesn't require huge amounts of money to save these collections. They are, in many cases, at risk. But no one's going to help natural history unless we help natural history ourselves.
As we're all aware, there has been a loss of specialist curators, which has gone on for many decades, but has intensified perhaps during the last sort of 5 to 10 years, especially the recession. And a recent survey of 34 UK museums, which you can find on the Museums Association website, found that natural sciences have lost the most specialist curators of any discipline, with a decline of over 35% in the last 10 years. So the result of this is mainly orphaned collections, so collections with perhaps a specialist curator or without, in some cases, any kind of custodian. And it's particularly these collections that we review in the West Midlands area. And also, it's an obvious point, but these collections are often very vulnerable. So natural science collections, a lot of them, are particularly pest sensitive. So it's not just a matter of sort of sticking them in storage and then assuming that they'll still be intact sort of in 10 years when the situation improves and we want to use them. It's not always like that. And another obvious point that we can't say too often is that these very vulnerable collections are also incredibly crucial. For one thing, they are very popular with the public. And a recent survey that you can find on the NATSCA website of Londoners found that natural sciences was the most popular collections type with the public, with 82% of those questions saying they were interested in these collections. They're also incredibly important for their huge research value, not least for a unique ability to answer pressing practical questions on the world today, things like climate change, biodiversity loss and so on. So that's the situation. So the West Midlands Biological Collections Review itself is funded by the Arts Council. It's managed by Birmingham Museums Trust, my employer. As natural sciences curator there, it's responsible for about 20% of my time, which makes up about 100 days over 2 years. And it involves a budget that covers my time and travel, but not particularly for specialist experts, so I can't be getting in teams of people to review particular collections around the region. And when I started just over 6 months ago, my first task was to decide, with these resources, how the review could be as helpful as possible over the next 2 years. So there were sort of 3 broad choices that I considered. So depth versus breadth. So it had been suggested that I could focus on a particular collections type within natural sciences or on a small range of museums. But I felt this might exclude the museums and the collections that would benefit most from the review. Not knowing if we'd have an opportunity and the funding to do this again, I thought it would be better to aim for breadth, to cover all collections types where possible, and all museums, and to use the review to inform more in-depth work in the future. And secondly, there's a balance between practical help and forming an overview. So I very much want to do both with this review. So during the initial visit to the museum and the report that's written up afterwards, I'm thinking in terms of what I can help with the museums now, as well as forming an overview that might be useful for advocacy in the future. And finally, I had the issue of how qualitative or quantitative the review should be. So should I just be seeking to describe collections, describe their care, or to actually rate them? And there's many problems with actually rating things, but the reason I decided it would be better to try is because it's better as an advocacy. It's better for advocacy if you actually are able to say, for instance, that 5 collections of high significance or national or regional significance are at high risk, rather than just being able to say that some collections in the West Midlands are at some risk.
I'd like the panellists first of all to each give as brief as possible, so we can open it to the floor, in what support do you think is needed within natural sciences? Yeah.
Well, I think any support would be appreciated. As I said at the end of my presentation, I think the most useful thing is sort of people on the ground, and whether it's at an institution or on a sort of regional kind of peripatetic basis.
Yeah, interesting. Listening to something that coming back to an earlier comment. What support is needed? Well, I don't know if there's necessarily any more support needed from natural sciences than I would say any other discipline within museums. I think all disciplines are suffering from the same situation natural sciences finds itself in, with perhaps the one exception. Yes, natural sciences collections are possibly the most difficult ones to store and look after. They decay, they have problems. So I'd probably start looking around the conservation areas first of all.
My thoughts around support needed, I agree with everything that's been said so far, but there's a kind of holding support, as I call it. In other words, we're in a very major sort of funding crisis at the moment, and resources are being cut across the board in all sorts of subject areas. But because natural science collections particularly take a lot of looking after and include quite a lot of very sensitive areas, not unique, but quite like insect collections, for example. There's a great need for support for care standards for those. And I think, as I was alluding before, the profession generally is quite keen to learn. So there's that. Beyond that, though, I feel very strongly that it's not just okay to look after these long term. We should be looking at new ways of using them, bring them back into use. Now, we might have to be practical and say that at the moment that is very limited, but we should be thinking further down the line, not just looking at the present, we should be thinking about the future and what support will be needed.
Again, I particularly agree with what Steve said, but also I think support can come in many ways apart from financial support to provide people. Providing networks of support, so people, like Bob was saying, where do we go to find out this? Where can we find reasonably inexpensive ways of solving these problems? And also support with advocacy. We're in a position to be able to help say why these collections are important and help people really push that message home in their local authorities, in their local areas. Darren earlier mentioned that we had no chance of getting through to the heads of councils, for example. But do we know that? Do they actually realise they have something which contributes to solving world problems? Do they know that? Do they know that they have those things? And that's advocacy, that's why they're important. So I think we as a community broaden that out and help there. So that's a slightly different kind of support.
Well, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, I agree with everything that's been said, so I can't argue on this point. So I'll open that up to the floor. Has anybody got any different opinions? I mean, we've heard that we need financial, which obviously, I think it's time and money, which most of us would say we definitely need, but the advocacy role.
Principle that educators do is investigating an object in the way we've just done it with the bones. The classic one that's done in museum learning very often is the McDonald's box. Some of you might have done that before. Have you done how many things can you work out from a McDonald's box? It's all about the questions that you can ask from an object. And the one that we often do with teachers, I've got a little pack with these in. This is really quite a boring object, I would say. I offend certain people here, but it looks like quite a boring object. But actually, there are so many questions. So this is, first we don't tell them what it is either. So it's quite a boring object, but can anybody think of what questions could we ask about it to work out, to understand more about it? What would you like to know about this object?
What's it made of?
What's it made of? Okay, what's it made of? So that's one question. Any more questions? We won't answer it, we'll just ask the questions.
How old is it?
How old is it? How old is it? I want to know how old is it? What's it made of? How old is it? Anything else?
Where did it come
Where
from?
did you find
Where did it come from? Where did you find it? Which might be placed in the world. Where in that place did you find it? Other questions?
Was it curly?
Why is it curly? Why is it curly? Yeah, probably got inserts on there. Yeah. Anything else?
What does it smell like?
What does it smell like? Sandy. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
Did you kill it?
Did you kill it? Did you kill it? Yeah, yeah. So there are loads and loads of questions, and we do this quite often with primary school teachers to explain to them, because very often in primary schools, students bring things into the classroom for identification. Of course, teachers have no idea what it is, but we say, actually, you can use this because you can brainstorm with the whole class about how can we work this out? What is this? Where did you find it? Sorry, that hasn't come up terribly well, but there's just some examples of questions. But it's really easy to generate lots of questions, and then students can discuss them, they can go off, they can try and work out what the answers might be. We might have to work out some of them. So really, really motivating, also really value students' contributions. Now that which is about promoting creativity. And that's really, really important about what we do. Here, I would say that most of the education programs that we do is based on the science curriculum. Well, sorry, I'm talking about school programs actually, but adults too. We do quite a lot of interacting with arts, right? Working with art students is really valuable and increasing emphasis on that. But really today I'm concentrating on the science. Really important, I would argue, for providing the creativity in science education. And I've got a little quote here, so it's a little bit small, I'll just read it out to you. One on the left is from a Year 9 student talking about their perception of science at school. So science at school, I find it quite mundane. There is nothing creative about it. It can be cool when you see something like a video of a chemical dropping into water or do an experiment, but everything is set out. Nothing is your own. In art, English, or in history, you can express your own opinion about why you think it's happening, but you just can't in science. Now, that is not for a student who's being badly taught or is not motivated. That is, I would argue, just a reflection of the pressure of science teaching in the current national curriculum. And I think that's really, really where we come in. And the other quote is from the Wellcome Trust Informal Science Learning Review. They did a big review, many of you might have contributed to it in 2011, 2012. And it's just the importance that we have got as museums in creating the next generation of scientists. Because we all know that science is actually a really creative activity. Great scientists are really creative people. And we need people to be motivated about science. I find that quote a little bit depressing because the evidence is that by age 14, Students have decided how interested they are in science. And if at 13 they've been pretty much switched off by then because of the way science is being taught in the classroom, they're not likely to opt to do it at a higher level. And so actually arguing for the role of informal science learning, by the way, just means learning not in a formal school curriculum, has a really huge potential for motivating the scientists of the future.
Collections can validate the reliability of previous generations of recorders. So if their collections are in the museum, we can look at how accurately their material was identified, and that enables the record centres to assess the validity of other records of theirs. The data on museum specimen labels is often more accurate than that which has been published. So you might get a list that this says this moss was found at Seathwaite in 1954, but the specimen packet, it actually gives you more information saying it's found in a crevice of calcareous rock at 1700 feet on base ground near Seathwaite on a specific date in 1954. So you can add quite a lot of extra information to basic records to museum collections. And specimens also enable recent taxonomic splits to be applied to historical records. If you don't have a specimen, you can't go back. If a species is split into 2 or 3 others, then unless you've got the specimen to refer back to, you really don't know which one you're talking about. This is a specimen of a shorebug, which I found new to Britain in the year 2000 on the Solway Firth. But when I was looking at the collection and explaining to a colleague what it was I thought I'd discovered, we found 2 specimens in the collection of that species which haven't been identified, but were collected from exactly the same place that I'd found them, but 70 years earlier, 1928. So that provided a whole different perspective on that new